Hello, friends. This is an honor to have Miri with me today. And yeah, of course, it is a gap of almost 100 days from my last podcast uh, to this one. There was a certain reason which I uh, would like to share with you. I wanted some rest, I wanted a break, I wanted some quality in production, and I was working on that. And today, with a new episode of P Talks, we are here. Miri Eisin is with me. She is from Israel. She is a retired colonel. She worked in intelligence services for almost 20 years, if I am not wrong. Now she is an expert on security. She is teaching. She is giving talks. She is a very wonderful lady. And my friend who introduced me with Miri, she was very inspired by Miri because she told me that when Miri joined army, it needed so strength to join in and make the ways for others to join in. So, a very well regarded lady in Israel, um, a thorough professional, a teacher, and what else I should say in your introduction, Mary?
Maybe we'll add in a mother, a very proud one, a wife. So, in that sense, I feel very fortunate that I had both a professional career and a very good family life.
That's right. That's right. And I welcome you in our podcast, P Talks. As you know, I am from Pakistan, as I know, and my viewers know that you are from Israel. And this is a new opening. This is a new window of opportunity for both of our countries, both of our nations, both of our communities. And I guess this is some kind of contribution we both are making towards a peaceful future.
I certainly hope so. And for me, Pierre, it's the first time to be talking, certainly to a Pakistani audience, but Pierre, it's probably the first time I'm talking to somebody from Pakistan. So it's very exciting for me sitting in Israel and talking to you in Pakistan.
Thank you, Mary. But it is one excitement for me that I am today. I am talking to a retired spy, but still a person who has served in intelligence services. And for which country? Israel. It's wonderful to have you, and I'm really excited.
I don't think of myself in any way as a spy. The intelligence profession has within it a lot of different aspects. My mother, my entire life, my professional life, thinks and thought that I'm a spy. My husband probably knows better. And there are a lot of aspects in the intelligence community which are not necessarily James Bond spy capabilities, and yet they're the backbone of the intelligence work both in Israel and worldwide.
That's right. Uh, that's right. And I was thinking this. It's like everyone thinks that whosoever is working in the intelligence community, he or she must be a 007, having guns in hand, dark goggles, looking behind the goggles, and the face is here, and you're watching the scene there, or sometimes behind your back. How it was, how you started, how to think of a profession which is not meant for women and very challenging for women to join in.
I live in Israel. In Israel, they have had the draft to the military from the establishment of the state from 1948. One of the first laws that was passed in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, was the law to be drafted, including women. And in that peer, Israel is very different from all other countries. There are very few countries in the world that have the draft for women. And Israel has had it from the beginning. Having said that, pretty much for the first 30 years, women were drafted and put in very specific clerical positions. They were mostly the clerks. They were the secretaries. Remember, once upon a time, you had to type. Nowadays, we all think of it as being, a given that we all know how to type. When I was drafted, a long time ago, 40 years ago in 1981, 95% of the women I was drafted with in 1981 went to clerical jobs. And I was very lucky. I'm sure as you can hear, as our listeners can hear, my English is not Israeli English. It is American English. My parents are American. They immigrated to Israel. My native language is American English. I studied French in high school. I'm quite fluent in French. And I studied Arabic at university. So when I was drafted, this is even before I knew Arabic, I was drafted because of my languages into the intelligence community. And I was very unique then and very lucky. And I was very happy that I wasn't doing clerical positions. I wasn't a secretary. I was doing the type of intelligence work that has to do with your capability to listen to other languages. It's a capability that is still relevant, but in today's technological world, these type of conversations that we are having can be automatically translated into most languages. I think there are 200 million Pakistanis. They overwhelmingly speak Urdu, and I am sure that somebody invented already that capacity to automatically translate. So I got in through the door of languages. Today it would not be the same because languages are pretty much translated automatically by technological capabilities.
That's wonderful. So, how was what were the challenges after joining the community? It was absolutely a different community where you are dealing with the information which is not always pleasant. It is not about environment. It is not about it. It is not about any musical function or a drama or a film. It is always about war. It is always about killings. It is always about attacks. It is always about threats. How
So
was it for you?
I'll look at it from an opposite. It's interesting, as you said, about war, killing, etc. And I'll define it. It's about the enemy.
Yeah.
Now, each country in their national intelligence community are going to define different enemies. From Israel,
Mm.
we border Lebanon,
Yeah.
Syria, Jordan, Egypt. When I was drafted in 1981, Egypt had already signed a peace treaty, but it was at the stage where you need to transition in the intelligence community of looking at Egypt as an enemy and looking at it in a different way. You are going to gather information in a different way about Lebanon or Hezbollah in Lebanon, about Syria now after a horrific decade of war. Jordan, we signed a peace treaty in 1994. So it's not that you're looking for enemies, you really don't want to have them. But what happened is that in Israel, there's been a transition from mainly state enemies, what Egypt was, what Jordan was, what Syria was, what Iraq was. Iraq participated in wars against Israel. Iran, which by Israel is still very much perceived as an enemy. And between non-state actors, it's a term, Hezbollah as an organization, Hamas as an organization, anything like, Daesh, Islamic State, the different types of that, how you gather information about them. I stepped in with English, with French, which immediately means that you're going to be going into areas where that's relevant. Later on in my military service, I studied Arabic, which opens up a lot more. And I, for my entire career, was the only woman in what I did. As I said, 95% of women went to clerical jobs. So I was of the very few women who went to intelligence. And then I was even, I want to say, lucky or fortunate or pushy, and I put myself out there. I went to officer's course. And an officer's course, of the 150 officer cadet trainees in the intelligence, we were 9 women and 150 men. So it just that, and that would continue with me at every stage of my career, that it was both about your capacity and capabilities in the intelligence community to listen, to understand. I always felt I brought something additional into the room because for my entire career, I was the only woman in the room. Half the population are women worldwide. We have children. We look at the world the same and yet different. So that for me has been something that I've had my entire adult career.
That's right. And when you talk about enemy, let me ask you, in 1971 or in 1975, 1978, 1984, these 4 periods, where you think and where you saw Pakistan standing? Of course,
So
for Israel.
remember,
Yeah.
it's so important. Remember that a few things. One, Israel and Iran had strong diplomatic ties until the fall of the Shah. Now, I'm not here to say, and the Shah was a great man and that was a wonderful time in Iran. No, no, no. But we had full diplomatic ties between Israel and Iran until 1979. And in that sense, I'm sure that that impacts any additional ties. Pakistan, and I don't know, Pierre, if your listeners are aware, but Pakistan voted against the establishment of the State of Israel in the United Nations vote in November 1947. You were already members of the United Nations. You voted against, which is fine. Turkey voted against and has diplomatic ties with us. India voted against and has diplomatic ties with us. But we did not develop diplomatic ties with Pakistan. They may have been under the radar, but not over the radar. From the 1990s, which is later, Israel has developed diplomatic ties with India. And at the end, we are aware that India and Pakistan are not in the best of relations. And often if you go to one, you don't necessarily go to the other. I'm not saying good or bad, but when you say enemy, Pakistan has never been perceived as an enemy of Israel, ever. Pakistan did not send troops to fight against the newly established state. And you need to realize that Morocco sent troops, Algeria, Libya, Tunisia sent troops. It wasn't just Egypt. Saudi Arabia, Yemen, they all sent troops, certainly Iraq. So, in that sense, Israelis don't have a negative position and they're not an enemy. But you pointed out dates that also connect into nuclear capabilities, because Pakistan is a country that achieved nuclear capabilities. And those nuclear capabilities have an impact in the Middle Eastern world, which also includes Israel. So the Israeli intelligence community is going to look at the nuclear challenge, and Pakistan is a nuclear country, as is India for that matter, as according to international media is Israel. Israel does not acknowledge that. And I say that because that means that we will be looking, but it depends in what way.
That's right. Miri, I mentioned 1984, and I believe that after 1984 or that time in 1984, somehow, somewhere, there was kind of cooperation going on between Israel and Pakistan inside Afghanistan in first Afghan war. Both the countries were uh, very close allies of USA in this region. Pakistan was frontline state. Israel was somewhere there behind the curtain, but the technical support, technology, it was coming from Israel. And there is the Charlie Wilson's war is all about the close cooperation of Pakistan and Israel inside Afghanistan. And later on, we have heard because we just we have just read it in newspapers or heard stories about it. You are the eyewitness whether there was a kind of cooperation whether there was behind the curtain, behind the folk wall, there was some sort of engagements between both the countries.
So, first of all, in 1984, I was a lowly officer. It takes time and to remember, I only was drafted in 1981. I only became an officer 1982. And then when you're at very low positions, you're not necessarily there. The intelligence community here is not open.
Yeah.
It's very segregated. It's very separate.
Yeah.
You keep secrets within it. You keep it separate. That's part of how you save it. Outside connections, the Israeli intelligence community is made up out of three main, very separate organizations that work in cooperation, but they have different assignments. And all of the ones that are outside of Israel, and certainly I can attest that at the parallel time, Israelis were in Kurdistan, okay, in the northern part of Iraq. But the Israeli intelligence that does those kind of actions is the Israeli Mossad. They do things more overseas, and certainly quite, and I don't want to say openly, but much more overtly, Mossad was assisting Kurds in northern Iraq. To say that it was in Pakistan, I don't know. This was not my forte. I wasn't working in that arena. And in time, I think that what happens often is when you have joint strategic challenges. And I think Pakistan, including today, has very joint strategic challenges when it comes to not just the Taliban as the Taliban, but very extreme jihadi versions of jihadi violent versions of Islam. And that's something in common. And then the question is if you find common ground to work together against those common enemies.
I agree. I agree. And now we have a newly popped up challenge from your neighborhood to our neighborhood. It's ISIS. Now, ISIS has a strong footprint in Afghanistan, which is next door to Pakistan. And you have a great experience of dealing with ISIS because it was in your neighborhood. but you did not let them enter in your uh,
Backyard.
country backyard. Yeah, of course, that's
Yeah.
that's a proper word. So, and rather than the intelligence or the spy games, I always advocate about the common potential of Pakistan and Israel. Like, you are a giant in technology. We have the world's most emerging human resource, and we have the capacity. CPAC is a common ground here, uh, which is a gateway for many of our neighboring countries in the region towards not only for China but towards Central Asia. And of course, there is a huge potential of both our countries to go along side by side towards a peaceful future. And of course, the Abrahamic Accord is paving the way. How do you see it?
I'm very hopeful because what's happened over the last year, two, and I'll even say decade, the decade that on the one hand brought us the Islamic State, on the other hand, also brought for the first time a much more open cooperation. You know, there are different levels. You can cooperate, you can collaborate, you do things together. And there's no question that over the last decade, with the rise of Islamic State, other jihadi types of that sort in our area, that was an impetus, a pushing of Israel to be in cooperation of both the Gulf countries and from the Gulf countries over to Morocco, Gulf countries, Morocco, both United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco, and then Sudan. You know, if I want to give an example, for me as an Israeli, if Sudan can get past its heavy support that it had of different jihadi fighters throughout the Middle East and become looking more towards mediation, to not being in that type of violent confrontation, then of course it should be so within a country like Pakistan that has an education system, that has a whole, as you said, half your population is probably under the age of 25. Such amazing potential. Sudan's an incredibly poor country who's doing it to get out of the place that it's in. And then you come and you say, how can it not be that we don't go to something so much more relevant like Pakistan? So I'm very hopeful. What are the challenges? The challenges are getting past the mindset, both of both sides in that sense, of looking outside the box. I think that Israelis, certainly at the top level, are going to say, reaching out to Pakistan, how does that impact Israel's relationship with India? And I put it out on the table here because those are things that are going to be impediments. But I am very hopeful that the one should not be about the other, that Israel's relations with each different countries are about commonalities, both common challenges, enemies, but also the common good. Technological world, exporting, being, as you said, a road, a path to additional countries.
Miri, do you remember what was the role of Pakistan settling down the relationship between China and America?
And in that sense, that's exactly that back door of opening up. Pakistan has in that sense. I mean, when you read both about, I of course have not been to Pakistan. I'm Israeli and sadly I cannot visit, though I must say I've heard of a few Israelis, you know, they do that whatever with dual citizenship, but
Yeah,
I have not been one of those. But you read both of the amazing 1,000-year-old history
yeah.
of the capabilities of the government, and most people, I think, are not aware of your map, of your geography, of the different borders. You have
Mm,
amazing borders
mm,
with so many different countries that always surprise
mm.
people. So absolutely, the capability to open the door to a country like China, but you're on the edge of what I like to call the Stan countries. that Israel has some connections with, but you're on the backside of that door there too. All Muslim countries who together are an incredibly important future of Central Asia.
Yeah. And I was pointing out towards, like, it's a wishful thinking, but if Pakistan can mediate good relation between China and America, why not Israel can mediate good relation between Pakistan and India? So,
And I think it's so relevant because both Pakistan and India and Israel and the country, the Arab state, Palestine, that did not come to be, but both of them are results of British policies, of British rule, of getting past that stage, kind of growing up and saying, okay, that happened in the 1940s. Once upon a time, Great Britain used to be, a world power, not so much anymore. And they made their own choices at the time that oh so impacted in such a strong way the establishment of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh later on in that sense, but Israel and the state that did not exist then, that Arab state and that whole that could be an amazing bridge. Let's look at that and see how we bring that to bridge over conflicts. It would be wonderful. By the way, I was in India on the Pakistani border where they have a very, I want to say, amusing daily ceremony at the border on the two sides, on the Pakistani side and on the Indian side, next to Amritsar. It's very interesting.
that's right. And let's get back from the intelligence talk to home challenges. Let's talk a little about that. How it was having this profession in your life and a normal family. How challenging it your profession was for your marriage. How challenging it was for you as a mother.
So that's probably always going to be the most challenging aspect for any couple. But I think that one of the things that happened in the 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century, let alone in the 21st century, is that they've made life harder for women and not just more interesting. Because until the 1950s, even 60s, you didn't, as a woman, you didn't really have the options. You were a mother. You didn't get to really do both. And it's a gradual kind of growth. I feel very fortunate that I was allowed to do both. But that allowing to do both makes an enormous challenge. My husband, Pierre, is also from the military. We both grew within these professions together. It means that we have a very common professional ground, and we can talk about what we do. When I said before also, when we were mentioning also Afghanistan or Israeli involvement, secrets are secrets, and I can't really talk about my profession unless it's with people who are exactly in the same profession. There are many couples within the intelligence community. It's a very common thing that happens because otherwise you can't talk about what you do. So that's one way, is that in my, happily, in my own family life, I found a partner who is somebody who's both a friend, but also a colleague. And also, I mean, we've been married for over 25 years. Okay, it's a long time. And we both grew in it together. The balance with children. Well, I think that is the biggest challenge for women in the world of today, because it's very personal. I found it easy after the first child, harder after second child, and really challenging with child number 3. I'm very happily, lucky, fortunate, blessed that I have 3 lovely children. They're already older. They're in their 20s, late teens. And I it's a constant question of what you do. So I think that it's a personal one, that every person needs to find the correct balance for themselves. My balance is that I need to work because otherwise I am unhappy, me, Miri. But I need to find a balance where I can both work and be part of my family. I said, if I'm unhappy because I'm not working, that's not good for family or for children. If I'm overworking and I'm not seeing my family, I'm not going to be happy in my work and I'm not going to be. So it's a delicate balance. I was very much helped by family, which I think is very Israeli. And I think it's also very Pakistani, isn't it? That people rely on your family, on my parents, my in-laws, my husband's parents, my sisters. I mean, you rely on the family to, I'm not going to do that because it's too much.
Yeah. So, as in this short time of disconnection, we were talking about the technological advancement in the world, and especially when it came in front of many of us in the Corona times, the connectivity, the blessing of technology. Like today, I'm talking to you, and with an Israeli lady from Pakistan, and it was so challenging a few years back to find someone, and I found it always exciting. Oh, you guys are normal people. Okay, you have two eyes, you have a similar face, you have two hands. You are not butchers. You are not having horns on your head, which is unfortunately uh, uh, propagated against uh, you in this particular region of the world where I am living. And you know that our neighbors love you so much that they always talk about you.
We're in the news a lot, and my cynicism and sarcasm usually comes out at this stage. Here, I actually teach courses at the Bar Ilan University, which is the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya. It's a lovely private college that I am also a fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism there. And I teach a course on the narratives of the conflict. And inspired by today, I'm going to have one, because my students do different papers on the different ways different countries, different leaders view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And inspired by this conversation, I am going to go have somebody do Pakistan this semester, because I want to see what they're going to come up with. They'll go into Pakistani websites. It's true, it'll be in English, and view the terminology, the framing, as you said, the horns, the tail, the horrific aspects. I need to view it and to see it. I'll also have them check what the official Pakistani leaders what terms do they use? How do they look at it? So I'll have a paper within a few months. One of my students will write about it.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And Miri, what do you think of Abrahamic Accord, and how you see that? It was kind of so fast, quick, and suddenly it started happening in the last few months of Trump tenure, and then suddenly we found things very slow. Is it the course of time which is taking time, or it is procedural things which are taking time now? Or you see a quick expansion in the Abrahamic Accord and the framework very soon? How you see it?
So I think that the Abraham Accords are very different from the peace treaties that Israel signed with Egypt and with Jordan. Why are they so different? Because the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain were not independent states in 1947-48. They were British protectorates. They only got independence themselves in the early 1970s. In an odd way, it connects to our conversation about enemies and war and fighting and killing. You don't have people who fought, who participated in wars against Israel in that sense, back and forth, not from the United Arab Emirates, not from Bahrain. I'll talk in a moment about Sudan and Morocco, which are part of the Abraham Accords, because that's different. The Abraham Accords have been going very quickly from the Israeli perspective. Because at the end, it's diplomacy. It's not overnight. But on the people-to-people, public diplomacy between the people of the young, the 20-year-olds, the 30-year-olds of Israel and United Arab Emirates and of Bahrain. Here I'm looking around here, and I'm going. It's hard for me to believe because we've never had that type of relationship with Jordanians or Egyptians. Because if you're going to meet somebody from Jordan or Egypt who today is 20, then their grandparents fought in the 1948 war. Their parents fought in the 1967 or 1973 war. Both the Egyptians and the Jordanians had an enormous amount of casualties, as did Israel. But because of that, it's very hard to disconnect your family history. The enmity of the two. Again, it's just very challenging. So it never developed into a people-to-people one. But look at what's happening over the last months and years. Even in Corona, Israelis visiting both Gulf countries coming visiting here, both officially and unofficial. It's quite amazing. It's a bit different. It's a bit different with Sudan. Certainly in Morocco, I'll talk on the last one. I mentioned it is very much out of Sudan's poverty, weakness, their need for economic development, economic investment. They're not getting it from Iran, Turkey for that matter. And so they chose as a decision to the West, in this case to the United States, and it feels like the price that they need to pay is having an agreement with Israel, but I don't expect it to develop a quick, warm Sudan. Both as part of Egypt, both and then as a separate country, and then as a participated again in the wars against Israel. They have a lot of challenges. Having said that, it's wonderful that they won't be in that cycle of both the violence and the extreme violence organizations that Sudan was a base over the last 20, 30 years. Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic State, all used as the place to buy weapons, to train weapons, and Sudan is closing that down. That is a good, more peaceful Morocco. Morocco is a little different. Morocco is a country. Almost 10% of the population until 1948 was Jewish. And yes.
That's amazing. 10%. It's a big number.
It's a very big number. And in the 1948 Morocco sent against Israel. They both voted against it. They weren't an independent country in 1948 yet. They were still under French rule. Morocco sent a Moroccan troop to fight in 1948. In 1967, Morocco was an independent country. A brigade to fight against Israel in 1967. Israel in the 1967 war, that there's 10% that were Jews, and what happened from 1948 until 1967, I don't know the exact number nowadays. They talk about hundreds maybe of Jews, thousands, maybe but thousands, but it used to be hundreds of thousands. And they immigrated to Israel. Most of them immigrated to Israel in the 1950s, 1960s, when Morocco got independence from France, together with the Jews of Algeria, and the Jews of Algeria, and the Jews of Libya. They all got independence. They all got independence. And they all had substantial Jewish populations, but Morocco by far was the largest. When you come to Israel, and you ask Israelis who they are, they'll talk about their background. They'll talk about their background. My parents are from the United States. My great-grandparents immigrated from Eastern Europe to the United States. But in Israel, hundreds of thousands of Israelis whose background is Moroccan, who have a whole Jewish culture that they brought here. Food, it's music, it's the way they pray. Hebrew, it's the Moroccan way. Okay, so all of that is something which means that I expect the relations with Morocco to be something which is much more culturally based, where you have a much stronger basis in Morocco, in the sense like Pakistan, a very large young community, very technological, looking towards being part of the modern world. So that one I hope to develop more. And the last point is that for me as an Israeli, do you realize, Pierre, for the first time ever in the last year, I can get on a plane, fly from Tel Aviv to Manama, from Tel Aviv to Dubai, from Tel Aviv to Casablanca or to Rabat. It's amazing.
Yeah, I can understand. I can understand the excitement, and I can understand how big it was to establish ties with the countries like Morocco,
it's also that,
Sudan,
yes,
UAE, especially UAE, and Bahrain, because the neighboring countries which were having conflict with Israel, if they are entering in a normalization pact, that is something very valuable for Israel and Israelis. And how was, okay, now I'm not talking with Colonel Mary. As a mother, how big was the challenge of security for you? How important was peace for the future of your kids? And how threatened you felt yourself as a mother?
It's an amazing question that you're asking. I'll give a few examples. From 2000 to 2005, there is a war that we call the Second Intifada, which was between Israel and the Palestinian arena as a whole. 2000 to 2005. It's when my child number one, child number two, child number three, they were all quite young, very young at the time. And in Israel, the day-to-day life was, do you go to the supermarket because supermarkets could have a suicide bomber? Do you send your child to the local kindergarten? Do you feel safe? Every single kindergarten needed to have a security guard. It's a question also of economy. Can you afford to pay for the security guard, but how can you not have a security guard? Will you allow your children going to school, again, 2003, 2004, 2005, get on a bus? And for me as a mother, it became this aspect of you take your children door to door because you don't want to go on public buses because public buses are dangerous. That's a terrible thing to do. You think twice about how they walk, where they go. Having said that, from the end of the Second Intifada, 2005, that's already 16 years ago, and my children have grown and flourished. As a mother here, the biggest challenge in Israel is the stage as a mother when your children are drafted. Remember, I was drafted. My husband was drafted. Our children were drafted. How do you feel as a parent when your child is drafted? So it's a sense of security where on the one hand you say everybody has to serve. You want the service to be one where it gives a better future for everybody. I would be very torn if my children needed to serve physically in combat units. They weren't drafted into combat units. I kind of feel as a mother that it made my life much easier. My heart goes out to the parents whose children are drafted. Remember, they're not volunteering, they're drafted. And when you're drafted into a combat unit, what do you do as a mother? How do you feel about your child having both to learn that type of profession that you were talking about before? The last point I'll say as a mother who's also a colonel is that you always want to avoid war. That doesn't, but when you say always, that doesn't mean that I'm willing, as an Israeli, as a mother, and as a colonel, to avoid war to then not be. Meaning there is a stage where you say, we exist. Part of our existence here is that there are many organizations and countries, for that matter, who say that we have no right to exist, that we should be destroyed. I'm not great at maps, but I know that Pakistan borders Iran. And the regime of Iran, the president, the supreme leader, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, they don't play around with it. They call for my destruction. That's me, Miri. They say Israel has no right to exist. So when I want to avoid war, I will do the most. War is terrible. There is no pretty war. There is no nice war. At the best, there can be a just war. And even then, it's going to be ugly and dirty and harsh. So as a mother, I am very aware of that. And I hope for all of us that we can arrive at a stage where if we're not going to be acknowledged in our existence, that at least we won't be vilified or accused or horrifically criticized for defending ourselves. And having said that, I want to be clear, defending ourselves does not mean that we're allowed to do everything. Not at all. We need to be able to look at ourselves in the mirror, in our children's eyes, and to know that what we did is moral, is just, is in defending, and always remember that on the other side are not just soldiers and enemies, but people and civilians, and to understand what that means.
That's right. That's right. And I agree with that. Hari, I wanted to ask you now, Colonel Mary, I wanted to ask you something. There is a perception that Israeli army is acting offensively against Muslims. A little people on our side of the world, they know about the fact that there are so many Muslims serving in Israeli armed forces. And I would like to have your comment on it, and of course, your experience as a colonel working with your co-army man or colleagues, Muslim colleagues in your army or in your law enforcement agencies, how it was, and how does it work in Israel?
Okay, so Israel as a country is made up out of a majority of Jews, and Jews come in various forms, but 75% of Israelis are Jews. 20% of Israeli citizens are Muslims. Most of the Muslims are Sunni. We do also have a small Shiite community, an Alawite community. And in addition, so that's 75 plus 20. In the 5% of Israeli citizens that are not Jewish and not Muslim, we have additional ethnicities and religions. For example, we have Druze, which Muslims have a complicated relationship
Yeah.
with. Okay, I'm putting it out there. And we have, but we also have in Israel, I mean, we have Alawites. There's an Alawite town, which is also a spur out of Islam or in Islam. And in Israel, what was decided, I said before that we have the draft. And in 1948, Pierre, when they decided that all Israeli citizens need to be drafted, already then, 15, today it's already 20%, but 15% of the population were Arabic-speaking Muslims. Who was Israel fighting in 1948? Lebanon, okay. Syria, Jordan, Egypt, as I said before, Moroccan, Iraqi, or Saudi, or Yemenite. These are all countries that are Arabic-speaking, but overwhelmingly Muslim. And so because of that combination of Arabic-speaking and Muslim, Israel said, we will not draft Muslims into the military, but any Muslim who wants to volunteer is allowed to do so. From 1948, there are two one Arabic-speaking, one Muslim community. The Druze are drafted. They're not Muslim, but the Druze are drafted. The men, not the women. That has to do with culture. But we have, do you know the Circassians? It's Russian-speaking Muslims who come from the Caucasian mountains. And Israel has citizens who are Circassian. They're drafted, Russian-speaking Muslims. But the 20% of Israeli citizens who are Muslim, mainly Sunni, to this day are not drafted. Specific portions of them always volunteered. When you volunteer, then you do the same service as somebody who is drafted. So I have served over the years, mostly with the Muslims who volunteer. They come from Bedouin communities. The Bedouins, nomadic tribes throughout the Middle East, and there are certain Bedouin tribes in Israel where when the men reach the age of 18, they volunteer. But there are lots of other tribes who don't. So I have served with Bedouin who are Arabic-speaking Muslims. I have served with Circassian, who are Russian-speaking Muslims, because they are drafted. And one of the amazing things in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Forces, is that in the military, it's not an issue, because there's so much common ground that has to do with the military as a military, looking at common enemies and understanding the challenges. It doesn't make it easier for the Israeli citizens. That's most of the 20% that are Arab Muslim citizens of Israel are not drafted. They don't serve, and that will be a gap in Israeli society. Inside the military, it's very clear the respect for the different holidays. Next week is Nebi is the birth date. Okay. birthday of Muhammad. So that will be a day that any Israeli soldier, okay, who serves will have a day, a holiday. And the Israeli calendar knows it, but doesn't really acknowledge it. In the Israeli Defense Forces, they'll notice it more. There's great respect, certainly, for the Muslim calendar and all of the different Muslim holidays. But also in that sense, for something like maybe, I mean, in that sense, one where I was in Egypt once on the birthday of Muhammad, and oh my goodness, I was actually in a Sufi site, and it was so exciting,
Hmm.
so beautiful. So in the proper Israel, you won't notice it as much. In the IDF, there's more understanding. They're officers, they serve. They mainly serve in specific, they're very much in combat units. They don't like going into other units. They're in infantry units, and that's where they like to serve, both in the desert. We have a large portion, sorry, down south it's desert, but as trackers, as infantry fighters.
Thank you, Colonel Mary, for your time, for your presence in my podcast, and hope to see you soon, whether in Israel or in Pakistan. I'm optimist, and one day would love to host you here with your family, uh,
I would love that.
and hope that we can connect again and again and again for different topics, various issues, and someday with another podcast.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel very honored and blessed that I can talk to you and talk to your audience. And let's hope for a future that we can meet in Pakistan
Inshallah.
and in Israel.
Thank you.
Inshallah.